Good evening, everyone. We are just getting started here, actually letting everyone in to our session. So just hang with us for a moment and we'll get started. Let's see, we should be, or you should be able to see the beginning of a presentation, the slide showing FY 2022 Budget Town Hall Meeting. All right, folks are arriving. So once again, welcome to our City of Palo Alto Budget Town Hall meeting. I'm Ed Shikada, City Manager. If you could just hold tight for a minute or two, we will wait for everyone to join us as folks are logging in. And we'll get started just in a couple of minutes. All right, looks like folks are still arriving, although it's stabilizing some. But we'll just take another minute. Once again, welcome to our City of Palo Alto Budget Town Hall meeting. I'm Ed Shikada, City Manager, and we are just pausing for a couple of minutes to let everyone arrive before we get started. If anyone's curious, and I'm not sure if participants can or attendees can see this, but we're showing 29 attendees currently. So we'll give it another minute just as people are still arriving. So let me do a quick check-in with folks who are presenting in a moment or two to make sure everybody's ready to go. All right, okay. Well, unless someone gives me a big signal saying, no, not yet, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, and we are at 33 attendees, again, for those who are curious. Once again, my name's Ed Shikada. I really appreciate everyone joining us this evening. We're here for our Fiscal Year 2022 Budget Town Hall meeting. This is really the first opportunity for members of the community to receive a full briefing and also ask questions regarding the proposed budget that was released last Friday, April 30th. We're scheduled here this evening. It's just a little after 6 p.m. and we're scheduled until 8 p.m. So we've actually got quite a bit of information that we'll be going through this evening. And so we'll pace it, but we are also planning to leave lots of time for questions and we will be using the Zoom format. So hopefully folks are on a device that will enable them to do that. And I'll walk through a little more in specificity as to how that will work in a moment. So, okay, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Just, let's to give you a quick overview of what we'll be discussing this evening. Really, the kickoff here of our fiscal year budget discussion. Fiscal year begins on July 1st. And as a part of the Palo Alto City Charter requirements, the city manager is to release a proposed budget for the fiscal year on or about May 1st. So on April 30th, once again, a full budget, both an operating budget as well as a capital budget or the construction budget also issued last Friday. The budget that was released reflects a strategy that really reflects a difficult time. No surprise to anyone that as we are hopefully coming out of this pandemic, reflects the need to focus on the community's immediate needs, while positioning to the extent that we can for an adaptive ability to respond to recovery, as hopefully it takes off more quickly than perhaps our forecasts have allowed us to reflect in this budget. Speaking of forecast, the City Council has discussed over the last few months the assumptions that should be used for this fiscal year budget, and Council has directed that this proposed budget reflect a relatively conservative recovery strategy, certainly in terms of some of the discussion that's happening today in terms of the expected pace. We had a range or a few different scenarios of how the economy might recover over the next several years, and effectively the Council directed a moderate growth over the course of the next 3 to 5 year period in our long-range financial forecast, what's referred here as long-range LRFF, long-range financial forecast scenario B assumptions. So again, just to acknowledge the obvious, this does follow an extremely difficult year and does reflect, as noted, the expectation of some continued fiscal challenges. And as such, we've had to make choices that reflect resource allocations that we recognize are not sustainable over the long term, but do reflect the necessity for the city to live within our means, so to speak, in ensuring that our expenses do not outpace expected revenues. Now, this proposed budget does reflect a process, and a step in the process that will extend over the next month and a little more than a month, and having both public discussions, the City Council's Finance Committee, and others, such as tonight, will be discussing how best to allocate available resources to provide services to the community. Next slide, please. Okay, so the format for tonight's discussion. We'll cover a few specific segments, including how we got here, again, some common sense reflection on the past year plus, but also some quantification of that, discussion of our annual budget in general terms, not assuming that members of the community track the city's finances on an ongoing basis. We'll discuss the proposed budget, including impacts and services as far as what reductions of services, as well as the focus of services over the upcoming year. And then next steps in terms of process, including reference to a survey that we have available online. And we'll be taking breaks through the different sections in order to enable members of the community to ask questions and allow us to respond to the questions as they come in. Next slide, please. Okay, now in terms of a little more on format and how we would like to run this meeting, recognizing we're in this Zoom format. First, the first bullet here, all participants asked to maintain civility and decorum. Let me start off, as I should have earlier, by recognizing that this is a really difficult conversation. We recognize that community members are all coming through more than a year of really difficult conditions and are hopeful and in many ways anxious to be returning to civic life. And we would like to do that as much as we can and certainly support the services provided to the community. The presenters you'll hear from tonight, which include our key staff working on our budget, as well as department heads responsible for specific lines of service, we're all in the business of providing services to the community. We're not in the business of cutting services until and unless it's necessary. So as such, these are not easy conversations for us any more than we know that they are for the community at large. So recognizing that, we will certainly understand that these are emotional topics and really reflect that and respect that and ask that we can continue our conversations as we work through our roles in this process in ensuring that the services are done in a fiscally responsible manner. So that said, with the Zoom format, if you have a question as we go through individual sections of the presentations this evening, would ask that you go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, where you can click on and go ahead and ask questions. We will pause and take questions related to the sections as we go through the topics this evening. And we'll have our moderator, Megan Horgan-Taylor, will help us identify in some ways, in some cases, perhaps synthesize the questions so that we can respond if we receive multiple questions on a particular topic. If we don't get to your question, we will have an opportunity, and we'll send out after tonight some additional information via blog post, a summary and perspective on some of the issues that were raised. Also do suggest, if you're on a phone, that since we are scheduled for a couple of hours here, that you try to get to a tablet or a computer that will allow you to type in questions. Depending on how we're doing on timing, as we go through the material, we may need to rely primarily on the typed in Q&A as a way to ensure we can get through all of the material and respond to the questions as much as we can. We will provide as much time as we can for live questions. And again, we also want to ensure that we're able to get through all of the information that we think would be of interest to community members. Let's see, and I believe that basically covers the overall format for tonight. And let me turn it over to Steve Guagliardo, our senior analyst, for our first opportunity for some feedback.
Thank you for that overview and introduction, Ed. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important conversation regarding the City of Palo Alto's FY 2022 proposed budget. My name is Steve Guagliardo, and I'm here to help us all get oriented to how the polling function is going to work tonight. So we'll be using a few Zoom polls throughout the evening to help promote some more interactivity and engagement as we all work through this Zoom platform. So the first question we have for everybody is, which of the following services are often not provided by a city or government? And Megan, I believe, will share that poll shortly. It should pop up as an option for each of you to fill out your answers. You should be able to select as many as you think are appropriate. I'll go ahead and start a timer. We'll give everybody about a minute to respond, and then we'll move on in our program.
And the poll is launched, so. We'll give folks another 30 seconds or so. About ready to end the poll in case somebody else wants to make a choice. Okay, ending the poll and sharing results.
So you can hear my timer going off in the background a little bit, but there are the results you can see. Out of 24 participants, 15 selected the Art Center, 3 selected Fire and Emergency Medical Services, 8 selected a library system with several library branches, 14 selected open space preserves, another 14 selected a full suite of utility services, including electric and gas, 15 selected Junior Museum and Zoo, and 16 selected the Children's Theater. So we can go ahead and close that now. And the actual response was that they're all right. The City of Palo Alto provides each of those services, unlike other comparable cities. We have our own art center with traveling exhibits, classes, and other events, as well as an additional public art program that provides public art throughout the city with more than 300 pieces in its collection. Our fire department and emergency medical services are different than other cities because our fire department not only responds to medical emergencies, they're also responsible for the medical transport. Unlike other cities our size, we have 5 different libraries, 2 central libraries, and 3 neighborhood branches. Many other cities only have 1 central library. And then we also have our open space and preserves with more than 4,000 acres of open space, more than 40 miles of trails that you can hike on. And we're hoping this year to open our newly constructed junior museum and zoo. The only comparable exhibit or facility like that is Happy Hollow in San Jose, which is a city with more than 1 million residents. Additionally, we have the Children's Theater. We have a full suite of utility services and many other things that are offered only by Palo Alto and not by other cities our size. We just wanted to have that quick reminder with everyone. Everybody was right. Everything you selected was something that the city of Palo Alto offers that not other cities do. But really, we also offer each of those, which no other city does. With that, I'll turn it over to our interim assistant city manager and chief financial officer and director of administrative services, Kylie Noze.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Kylie Noze, Administrative Services Director. So next, we're going to try and just do a nice ground setting on our annual budget. So on the next slide, we have a really tiny 2 pie charts, but those pie charts are showing what our city's total, at least right now, FY 2022 proposed budget is. So it's a budget that's about $690 million across all funds. So the city has a number of different funds, not just the general fund, enterprise funds that fund things like our utility services such as electric, gas, and wastewater that are funded by ratepayers. So if we look on the left side, you can see that the bulk of the actual revenues that come into the city are associated with the utility that we run. And if you actually look on the bottom left, you can see where things like taxes, which we spend a lot of time on, come into play. On the right side, you can see our citywide expenses are made up of salaries and benefits as a service-driven organization, capital improvement as we invest in our infrastructure that delivers the services. This isn't just buildings and facilities. These are also the gas lines, the electricity lines, the water lines, and then utility purchase. So this is the actual purchase of commodities in order to deliver those services to the community. We are at about 900 full-time positions across the organization. Okay, so as we just discussed, we are made up of a number of different sources of funds. Tonight, we're going to focus a lot on our general fund, which offers our general services to the community, things like fire, police, community services, library services. Prior to the pandemic, Palo Alto, as I'm sure everyone is aware, has enjoyed a very healthy revenue stream, a very healthy level of growth. And these really have helped contribute to that full scope of services in the general fund. So our second polling question is, do you know what the 3 largest sources of general fund revenues were for fiscal year 2019? So this is prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the primary ways that the city was able to fund services?
Thank you, Ms. Noze. I am watching our poll. Hope everyone can see that.
Yeah. We'll time it again, just like Steve did.
We'll do it for about a minute or so. There's actually a timer in the window, so I can help time.
Nice. Okay.
We have about 30 seconds left. Another 15 seconds. All right, I'm about ready to end this poll. Okay, and I'll share our results.
Wow, look at that. All right, so we have 95% say sales tax, 68% say property tax, 73% said transient occupancy tax, which is our hotel tax. So actually, you guys are all right. Those are our top 3 revenue streams prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's look at that. You can see right here, prior to COVID-19, in 2019, the city had total revenues of about $225 million. And you can see right at the top, property sales and TOT or hotel tax were our highest revenues in contributing to those services. So On to poll number 3. What do you think the city's revenue projections for the adopted 2022 budget was after seeing about a 5.4% increase in FY19 and a 9% increase in 2018? So as we were planning basically a little over a year ago.
All right, I'm launching that poll now. We'll take another minute or so.
And I'll just answer one of the Q&As live right now. Someone's asked, is the city required by law to have a balanced budget each year? And the answer is actually yes. The city is required by law, by our charter, to have a balanced budget adopted on by July 1, which is the beginning of our fiscal year on an annual basis.
We have about 20 seconds left in this poll. All right, I'm going to end this poll and I'm sharing the results on the screen.
Oops. All right, so the bulk of the group looks like has shown medium growth. So that the city had planned in FY 2020 to have revenues of about 235 million, or about 4% growth. And tied for actually second is slight growth versus a decline. So if we go to the next slide, you will actually see that the majority of the respondents were correct. So you can see on the far right, $232 million is what our 2020 adopted budget had assumed our revenue growth was going to be. So growing from 225 to 232 is how we had planned that fiscal year. And you can see that property taxes were about 21%, things like TOT were about 13% of our total revenues. However, 2 or 3 quarters through the pandemic, the city has seen a significant decline in revenues. And so we actually collected $210 million. And so that is obviously a decline year over year. And that is just the first 3 months essentially of the COVID-19 pandemic that onset in March. And if we continue to move through in 2021, which is our current year, we're estimating that revenues will continue to decline down to about less than 190 million. And as we move into 2022, based on those conservative estimates that our city manager just went over, that the council has directed staff to balance this budget in accordance with, we're estimating modest growth to $206 million. So you can kind of see as you go through this, things like property tax, one of our major revenue sources, stays relatively stable. And you might be wondering, well, why isn't it growing? And our year-over-year growth is primarily due to turnover, sales, changes in property ownership. And ultimately, one interesting factoid on our property tax is obviously the bulk of it does come from residential properties. However, on average, our property tax assumes a median home price of 1.1 million, when in reality, our home prices are about 3 million. Our average home price that our property taxes are assessed on is about 1.5 million, whereas our average, if you were to go to the market right now, is about 3.6 million. So you can see there's a big difference between how it's assessed versus what the market might bear at this point in time. The other one you can see is TOT. TOT has taken a precipitous drop. And ultimately, that's because over 60% of our TOT is from business and visitor travel. So over the last year, with both of those basically dropped to zero, except for critical areas, we have seen a significant decline in our third largest revenue. All right, we'll move on from this. So you can kind of see the difference in makeup. On the left are our 2020 estimated revenues, which were pre-pandemic, and our FY 2022 proposed revenue estimates. So what do these revenues pay for? On the next slide, you can see our general fund expenses were about 2/3 of our expenses go to direct frontline services. That's our libraries, that's our community centers, that's our police and fire, that's our planning and transportation at the development center, and for things like safe routes to school. So naturally, as we've moved through that precipitous decline that we just looked at, as we contracted the organization for the FY 2021 budget, we made swift, decisive, and super difficult decisions. And we balanced that approximately $40 million decline in revenues last year. The council took really stringent financial actions. And so you can see across the different service areas, the level of financial impact that each of them had felt. And ultimately, as we move through to the next slide, we have some of those impacts outlined. So as part of the 2021 adopted budget that council approved last year, we already reduced operating hours at community centers and libraries. We reduced productions and teen services and open space coverage. We reduced our fire prevention staffing. We reduced patrol in our police. We eliminated our shuttle service. We began doing eliminated contract and consulting services for much of our planning and building activities, including our long range actions. We reduced tree trimming, we reduced streets and sidewalks, and ultimately also reduced staffing in the strategic support areas. So those are the administrative areas. So we ended, or rather are starting 2022 facing these gaps. We already have reduced these, and yet we still are facing further financial constraints. So with that, I think we'll go to Q&A, and I'll pass it to Ms. Horgan-Taylor.
Thank you. So we are taking a few breaks between our different sections and our presentation to answer some questions through the Zoom function Q&A. There's been a couple of community members who have already asked questions, so thank you for that. If there are some questions related to the section that we just were discussing, feel free to add those into the Zoom function. We also are, of course, hearing from the community already about the budget. And so one thing I did want to start this Q&A session with is a question that we receive quite a bit of around revenues. And Ms. Noze, I'm wondering if you could answer this question around a business tax. What has the city's efforts been around establishing a business tax, and what could the potential be for something like that?
Sure, thank you for the question. So absolutely, actually, prior to the onset of the pandemic, staff were on a fast run towards the November 2020 general election. Actually, on March 23rd, frankly, we were going to review final strategies with the council on a business tax and the structure of it. However, as by that date, you can see that was also the immediate onset of the pandemic, and the council chose to delay that conversation and exploring that ballot measure until the next general election. So on staff's work plan, and actually to begin with the Finance Committee in June of this calendar year, so just a month from now, staff will be bringing up, frankly, the exploration of new revenue measures with the Finance Committee, and as a general tax would be on the November 2022 ballot, should the council proceed or decide to proceed with some an initiative like that.
Let me also add, if I could, that that timeline or time frame is prescribed by state law. Any city can only implement a general tax on a cycle consistent with the election of the city council in our case. So November 2022 would be the next opportunity for that topic to be brought to the voters. There is a provision under a fiscal emergency with the, if there were a unanimous declaration of a fiscal emergency by the city council, in which it could go off cycle, but not likely a scenario here, and therefore November 2022 would be that next opportunity for a ballot measure.
Thank you for that.
I've still got the floor. Since I was counting attendees, we're currently at 54. So in case members of the community are curious.
Ms. Noze, since I still have you, there is a question about property tax. and how that could go down. Would you have an opportunity to answer that?
Sure. So typically this organization, or rather city, during a recessionary period, does not see a decline in property tax, actually. So that is an astute question by the community. However, what it does see is it usually sees flat growth. So either between stagnant growth in property values or just changes in the property base and inflation and the CPI, the city usually sees a flat growth. So for example, during the Great Recession, the assessed value growth was 0.3%. So knowing that, there's a component of property tax that's one time or can be rather volatile, and it's a supplemental payment that the city receives. And so the city conservatively estimates what that supplemental payment will be, since it's not a guarantee and it doesn't necessarily follow the typical assessed value growth. So when the city annualizes for those one-time payments, it looks like a decline year over year, but the baseline estimate assumes a flat level of growth in our property tax.
Thank you. Another question we had was about one of the slides that talked about some of the past reductions that the city took. And it is what is meant by reduced open space coverage. And I'm wondering, is Kristen O'Kane available? Oh, thank you, Director O'Kane.
You're welcome. Thank you for that question. The reduced open space coverage is specifically related to staffing at open spaces. So it's the reduced number of rangers and open space technicians and other staff that would be available to help out at the preserves with patrolling as well as doing maintenance activities.
Thank you for that. There is another question that actually relates to our next section, but I do think it might be helpful just to set the stage for the next section. How much is the estimated gap for fiscal year 2022?
Sure, we were absolutely correct. We will go over that in more detail, but at this time we're looking at a $13.4 million gap for FY 2022.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. There are a couple hand raised. Karen Kwan, I think that you're interested in asking a question. I think we've unmuted you, so feel free to ask your question. You may have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hello, is that my turn? Sorry, this is Lisa Van Duzen. Is it my turn to speak?
Yes, you had your hand raised.
Okay. Thank you. And how long do we have? I'm sorry, I was on another call right then.
This is just a Q&A.
How long do we have to speak?
This is just a Q&A session,
Like
so just. Oh.
I'm just asking how long we have.
Well, Lisa, the format here is to ask a question and we'll respond to the question. If you'd like to make a statement, this really hasn't been formatted in a way to do that. So we've asked.
Well, I'll format it as a question, which is fine to do. Thank you. Sorry, I've had a lot of other things going on. Lovely to see you. Thank you for doing this. And I know you're working hard on the budget. My question really relates to kind of how might we as a community and as a city think about the budget as something where there are multiple resources to be brought in, and how can we think about leveraging the community's resources in addition to other resources to maximize what's available. And I'll just bring up the Art Center as an example of where there's the Palo Art Center Foundation that's done, I think, a tremendous job over time of raising money that leverages city money. So I guess what my question would be is how are you and thinking about that in a way of like, how can we maximize the total from the community, from other sources, and from the city as we go through the budgeting process? And it's true for not just the Art Center, but for the Children's Theater and other organizations as well. Thank you.
Sure, let me take a crack at that. Thank you for the question. I certainly believe it's an appropriate discussion that will really play out over the next few weeks with the City Council's deliberation. And we'll speak more specifically about what's upcoming, but the Finance Committee of the City Council is currently discussing the budget, as is the city's, and just to jump to a particular area, City School Liaison Committee. And so the topic of how to leverage resources among partners will certainly be a part of that discussion. So we'll be taking that on a topic by topic basis, but it's also certainly fair to be discussing that as a more global strategy, and certainly welcome any discussion or any initiatives proposed by organizations such as the one that Lisa's involved with. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I did want to get to one other question in the, and it may be actually answered in our next section, but given the estimated revenue for the coming year is similar to fiscal year 20, can you give an idea about why additional cuts are needed beyond what's already been implemented?
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. And also ask for some help from my colleagues here on this call. So overall, the year-over-year increases that are happening despite the reductions account for costs of doing business, to be honest. So some of our costs are contractually obligated that are going up year over year. Some of our obligations have an increased cost to us, frankly, year over year. And ultimately, some of our proposed changes last year were one-time in nature. And so as we were using things like reserves in various funds to help balance and offset the impacts last year, hoping that COVID-19 was going to be a short-term, I guess, impact, we do also need to address those on an ongoing basis now that we know that it's a more sustained recovery period.
I would just add that as we get into the next section of the presentation, we'll be able to discuss that in a little more specificity.
Thank you. We have time for one additional question. There is another attendee that has their hand raised. Rebecca Eisenberg, you have your hand raised. You'd like to ask a question?
Yes, thanks so much. My question is for City Manager Ed Shikada. Given that so many other cities have been overwhelmingly successful with regard to their emergency business taxes, and those taxes have included some of the most exciting and successful taxes that we've seen so far, what steps has Palo Alto actually taken to see if a emergency business tax only on the largest businesses like Tesla, Palantir, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, if that would work here? Thanks so much.
I would be happy to hear any more information you have about what you're suggesting. We really don't believe that that's viable under our circumstances. But again, as Ms. Noze pointed out, we do have it as part of the upcoming work plan that will be taken up later this summer.
So with that, I think we do need to move on to our next section. And I think that that is Director Noze.
All right. Moving through, where we're going to focus now is we've kind of ground set on where we've been and how we are now moving into FY 2022 and how staff has and the organization has pulled together our forecasts and this proposed 2022 budget. So on the next slide articulates the long-range financial forecast. So again, as we alluded to, we presented back to the City Council in February or March different scenarios for projected recoveries. And the council provided staff direction to choose a recovery period that showed about a 3 to 5 year recovery. So you can see in FY 2022, at that time, it had projected revenues of 196 million with about 1%, 2% growth year over year, with expense growth being 5.6%. So to an earlier question from a member of the community, that 5.6% is obviously outpacing the recovery growth on the revenue side. And therefore, that's what's causing, in part, the gap that we're projecting in FY 2022. So you can also see from this slide that it's not, if it is a 3 to 5 year recovery period, we're likely going to see constrained financial situations, not just this year, but over the next few years as we do work to try and grow our revenues out of the recessionary time. So just another way to look at those revenues. So you can kind of see the history of our major tax revenues like property tax sales, TOT, utility user tax, which is on utility bills. And so you can see we were on a great trajectory, frankly, up until 2020. And had the pandemic not hit, you see the yellow line, which is what the prior forecasted revenue growth was. But with the pandemic and the scenario that the council has chosen, you can see the precipitous drop and then that slow recovery where we're not reaching pre-pandemic levels until 2026. So how are we addressing this? So if you've already seen the council meetings on Monday and Tuesday night, apologies for some repetition on the next slides as we go through them here. But we are on the left side, you can see what the projected budget gap is. And what that's telling you is in the gray area is the lasting impacts or the ongoing impacts right now of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the revenue reductions. The blue box is the new component that is addressing, or rather contributing to the $13.4 million gap, which is a reserve that staff is establishing or a reserve that's being recommended based on current litigation. And so what this does, as I'm sure you've seen as noticings in the mail, is this sets aside the funds necessary to satisfy the current status of that legal proceeding. So we are faced with declining resources of $13.4 million. And on the right, you can see how the current proposed budget balancing strategy is laid out. So obviously a good component of it, 7.7 million, is associated with service or CIP reductions. So that's a reduction in either frontline services or back house services, just operations of the organization, but also a further reduction, I should say, in capital investment. We're draining some program-specific reserves to the tune of $1 million. And the bottom two are two big assumptions. There's 1.6 million that's assumed in labor concessions. And so this would assume a zero wage increase for all employees across the organization. This is something that we can't implement unilaterally and must be done in collaboration and coordination and mutual agreement with our labor groups. And then $3.2 million is used from the federal rescue or stimulus funds. So I'm sure many of you have heard that our president signed into law a $1.9 trillion rescue fund. And the city is expected to get about 12.5 million over a 2-year period of time. And so 3.2 million is being used to try and offset the severity of the reductions. There's 3 million set aside and unallocated for the council's allocation or use for any of the economic or labor uncertainties, and a tier 2 also for the uncertainties. And that tier 2 is really something we'll go into further, but basically the yellow boxes are kind of levers on both sides as we deal with the number and volume of uncertainties as we move through this budget planning process. So on the next slide, there are a number of citywide strategies. So in our capital fund, obviously we're significantly reducing our investment in facilities and our infrastructure. So it's about almost a 70% reduction from pre-pandemic levels, and actually only about $2.5 million of pure general fund funds are supporting our capital investments. We talked about the potential labor concessions. We will continue, or this budget assumes that the city continues to proactively fund its long-term liabilities associated with pensions and OPEB contributions. We as a city have a citywide hiring freeze, and all non-essential travel is currently banned, and the service reductions obviously are impacting things like office hours. And as we just discussed on the balancing strategy, we do have that federal funding assumed in this budget to help defray some of the more severe impacts. So over the next few slides, we're going to go through basically the areas that departments are looking to focus on as we move into 2022, as well as the additional impacts on top of what we just discussed as part of 2021's adopted budget that are currently proposed in this 2022 budget. So first is community and library services. So in community services, obviously continuing rec programs, theater programs, and art classes, and really looking towards high cost recovery levels. So making sure that as we are offering services, that we're able to recover the costs. Ensuring that parks and playgrounds and open spaces are open and maintained for safety. This is a really important tenet and value, especially as we're moving through and trying to recover from the pandemic, those open spaces and the safety associated with that open air. We are maintaining his RAP consistent with prior FY 2021 levels. And so there is no reduction that's currently recommended in those. And in library, we will continue to provide library services and really work towards connecting with the community through our 2 main libraries 6 days a week. And so we'll maintain all of our current collections. Now, obviously, not to say that there aren't impacts. So obviously there are reduced hours at the Art Center, reduced hours at the Teen Center, things like the administrative support for Copperly Artist Studio and some reduced staff support for the Children's Theater, decreasing our marketing funds, and also making sure that we are still supporting our outdoor spaces as we restore services, actually, or restore staffing to open space with a supervising ranger at Foothills. Library, as I mentioned, will move to a 2 primary hub system. So downtown Children's and College Terrace libraries will have the ability to pick up holds at those locations. However, the primary open hours will be at both Rinconada and Mitchell. As we move into public safety, fire, police, and OES will all continue to manage, obviously, the most critical and us during our most vulnerable times, answering calls for help, responding to calls for help, for fires, for medical, 24/7. We'll continue to investigate and enforce the laws. We will continue to, ensure that we have a force to respond to fires or other emergency situations. And ultimately still provide that ambulance and transportation services that I know this community is definitely near and dear to their hearts. So there are impacts as in any area. So in fire, this would brown out the flexible staffing model at Fire Station 2, where the station wouldn't be staffed when overtime is required. On the police side, it's a further reduction in our patrol staffing, and it would be eliminating our specialized units and reducing the staffing for investigations. Also, a reduction in our crossing guard services by about 50%, but ensuring that we are maintaining services at high traffic intersections and part of the common routes for school. We'll keep going. And one of the things that I just want to say as we move to the next slide and just kind of recapping on the prior 2 service areas is one tenet that I think you'll find through these proposals, and we can elaborate more through Q&A, is staff is really trying to balance continuing, frankly, the valuable services to the community, but also making sure that we're positioning ourselves to adapt. Obviously, the pace of recovery is extraordinarily unknown. We've moved in and out of color tiers over the past 12 months. And if there's one thing I think we as staff have learned, it's to be nimble. So one of the main tenets that we looked at as we were moving through how to adjust and balance the fiscal realities that we're facing as an organization is also making sure that we are ready and able to adapt quickly should the recovery happen at a more rapid pace than currently projected. Okay, so moving through planning and transportation. So we will continue to obviously do the core functions like planning, answering permit or evaluating permits, having a development center, and reviewing applications and entitlements for planning and building permits. And transportation will continue to work towards that reduction of single occupancy vehicle trips, maintaining that Safe Routes to School program, educating the families and children of our community, and a big project that many are aware of, working on that railroad crossing or grade separation capital project. Impacts are a reduction in current planning, which will impact cycle times associated with permit issuances. And on the transportation side, it's impacts to our consulting services, impacting our ability to respond to through and when notifications and some of the data services that we use to help with the analysis. And on the next slide, in Public Works. So Public Works will ensure that our facilities remain safe, especially in light of the COVID pandemic. We are working on ensuring that we are up to date on all of our health regulations. We'll continue to have urban forestry that's going to be looking at tree trimming and ensuring our canopy is maintained. We will make sure that the streets and sidewalks are maintained for health and safety. And we will continue to work on high priority items like the SCAP. As we move through, obviously there are impacts, and so we will see a reduction in maintenance staffing and some of our, and we'll see minimal rate increases in the next year for our enterprise fund rates. And of course, operating budgets. So these are service areas for internal services. So these are all the back of house that ensure that all of the front of house is able to do their jobs and have the employees to do their jobs and help out. So the strategic support departments, things like administrative services, all the appointed offices, IT, HR, the city council themselves as our governing body, will continue to provide the support to the organization, providing the leadership, the legal services, the financial services, the technology and HR services necessary to run all of the operations. But there are obviously reductions in these areas as well. And in these areas, we'll increase timeframes for assistance in departments such as recruitment or procurement of products or services, and increased risk as oversight diminishes. And as we move through, I think here's where we're going to just elaborate a little bit on General Fund Tier 2, which are potential additional reductions. So as part of this budget, given all of the uncertainties and some of the assumptions in the budget that the city can't unilaterally take, such as labor concessions, the staff has put in, as part of this proposed budget, Tier 2 reductions that are not proposed, but are alternatives if needed. And there's a number of instances where they may be needed. And these are much more severe reductions, such as the closure of facilities. So such as the closure of a fire station or the closure of the children's theater, or the full closure of neighborhood libraries without the hold services. This would obviously make a more significant reduction in our public safety personnel. And more significantly impact, frankly, all of the departments across the organization. So I think here we'll take a pause and do some Q&A.
Yes, thank you. So there are a few questions in the Q&A feature that I wanted to try to get to first. There's a few questions that I know in the next section we're likely to also talk about library services and community services. So I was trying to decide whether to kind of hold those. But there are a few questions, Ms. Nozay, that kind of speak to just overall budget related items. So one is, how many dollars are there in the city's reserves?
Thank you for that question. The city maintains a primary reserve. It's called the Budget Stabilization Reserve, or BSR. And currently that's projected to be $35.7 million. That's about 17.4% of general fund expenses. The council has a target of 18.5%, so we are below that, as we did use that reserve to offset that decline we went over earlier in our 2020 revenues. but it is within the target range of 15% to 20% of general fund expenses.
Thank you. There's another question that's asking about the utility transfer. Is this issue one-time or ongoing? And is it possible to replace this reduction with a tax?
Sure. Let me take a crack at that and also ask our city manager to help me round that out. That $8.4 million figure right now is currently projected for the coming 4 years with an ongoing $4 million thereafter. So for 22, 23, 24, and 25, it would be 8.4 million. After that period of time, we're looking at a $4 million ongoing impact associated with that current case. And so that has to do with some of the one-time historical actions associated with that litigation, as well as what the ongoing impacts would be as currently stands.
Again, if I could just restate that. So it's we're assuming 3 years of $8 million, 8.4 per 4 years, I'm sorry, 4 years of $8.4 million per year, and then thereafter $4 million per year. So it really is an ongoing revenue reduction, while the first 4 years is a higher revenue reduction than expected further out. So then to the question of whether it could be replaced with a tax, certainly that could be among the options that could be considered again in 2022. There are a variety of tax concepts that have been discussed in various forums. And again, the City Council later this summer will have an opportunity to start focusing on what both form and amount and uses are of greatest interest and viability.
Thank you. There's also a question about if the city has considered renegotiating contracts as part of a way of trying to balance the budget.
Sure. Director Nose, I think, touched on this. There are a couple, a few different tracks that's on. This ongoing discussions with our labor organizations are definitely a part of this budget strategy. It includes both existing contracts that are in place with our public safety bargaining units, as well as ongoing negotiations with our non-safety bargaining units. So having all participation by all of our employees is definitely a part of the strategy. And at the same time, as Director Nose pointed out, the city management, city council cannot take action unilaterally. There is a requirement under state law for negotiation. And so we're in the midst of that process.
Great, thank you. There's also a question about the public safety building and if that's a potential to defer that, and if so, what's the penalty?
Yeah, a couple of pieces to that, and we will talk more about the capital program, CIP, as we're referred to at the capital improvement program. The public safety building is an existing contract, so the contract with the construction company has already been executed, and as members of the community may know, construction has already started, or at least pre-construction activities. So there's a contractual obligation. Perhaps as important is understanding of the financing for that project. It is through what's known as certificates of participation, but effectively in terms of the financing plan, reliant on hotel tax revenues that are expected to increase over the next several years. The first payment on the loan, so to speak, is not due for more than 2 years. So it really reflects the deferral of any cash payment necessary for that project. So in effect, what that means in terms of the current year budget is even if we canceled the contract, there would not be any additional cash available for services for the upcoming year.
Thank you. We've heard community questions about teen services and children's theater impacts, and assuming safety protocols let us open, I'm wondering if Director O'Kane might be able to talk about what services the community will be able to see in the coming year, and maybe talk through that a little bit.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So while we are seeing reductions to several of our programs, we still have a significant amount of programming and activities for youth and teens. So for example, in our recreation division, we will continue to offer middle school athletics at the junior high level. Jen Keeper. Sorry about that. We will have multiple things happening right now. We will continue to offer middle school athletics, and as well as our teen leadership programs through the recreation division, and our Bryant Street Garage Funds, which is also known as the Think Fund, will continue to provide funding for many of the leadership programs that we offer through recreation. And we will continue to provide our summer camps, as well as many of our children's theater and other programming for youth and teens. So while there is some reduction, we are really striving to continue many of those programs across the department.
Thank you for that. There are a few questions in the Zoom feature around library services. So I was hoping that Director Kanth might be able to answer a question around the library and how it evolved last year due to the pandemic, and maybe share how the budget proposals position the library to scale back up. One of the questions in the chat here is trying to just better understand the budget proposals and why there wasn't a reduction of library hours instead of what some of the proposals are, which is some full library closure.
Thank you for that question. I want to start with something really great, that some of our libraries are now reopened, and our community members are enjoying browsing safely inside the library. We know that in the next fiscal years, there are some difficult decisions and choices that we are making. Our two large anchor libraries will be open for 6 days a week with some evening hours. These two libraries are open primarily because they're not just used by the neighborhood they are in, but also by all the community members. Because they are larger, they have larger collections, there's more meeting spaces and other spaces. There's more professional librarian availability to answer queries and questions, and also to provide a lot more programming. In addition, the community is still under COVID restrictions, and that has been fluctuating. So if there is any change, we would be able to provide more services out of these bigger libraries safely and efficiently. Pre-COVID, 76% of the total visitor count in any of those 5 libraries were from these 2 libraries, Mitchell Park and Rinconada. About 78% of the circulation came out from these 2 libraries. The other library that was very high in circulation is the Children's Library. And because these collections are very popular, we will be relocating up to 75% of that collection to the Rinconada Library, which is located about 0.3 miles from the Children's Library. The smaller libraries, in order to maximize services, we are looking into some alternate services like what we call the Library on Demand, which is actually an automated materials vending machine, and also hold lockers for these closed libraries. Virtual programs last year have been very, very popular. In the last year, we've actually doubled the number of programs, about 900 programs that we've offered, and they've all been virtual. And once it is safe, we will begin offering in-person programs, but we have found out that there's quite a different audience that would prefer virtual programs, so we will be continuing offering a variety of virtual programs.
Thank you very much, Director Kanth. There is also a question, and I meant to actually have a part 2 with Director O'Kane. I'm wondering if Director O'Kane could talk a little bit about the Children's Theater and what the community can expect in the coming year related to the budget proposals, and better understanding potentially how these programs potentially could be restored.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So our children's theater reductions are really related to costuming. So traditionally, the children's theater has had costume designers and creators on staff. What we're going to need to do moving forward is really rely on some of the existing costumes, costumes on loan, as well as even volunteer participation in developing costumes. So we are going to continue to offer the same programming we've had in the previous year, which includes classes and camps, as well as some productions, but just limiting sort of those, I guess what we might call extra benefits to being part of the children's theater, which is those really high quality costuming and experiences that we've had. We're going to need to really rely on additional ways to provide those in the coming years, and to still be able to produce amazing productions and offer the great programming that the children's theater does.
Thank you. I think we do have a couple more minutes for questions. I see a few hands raised, so I wanted to jump over to a few of the folks that had their hand raised. Aleem Kim, I see that your hand is raised. I think you also had a question in the chat, so I was hoping that you could unmute yourself.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
My question is about cutting funding to crossing guard service. I've heard that right now there's 30 crossing guards in Palo Alto, which will be reduced to 15, which is a service provided by the City of Palo Alto Police. Given that we're coming out of a pandemic where students barely bike to school this year, this past 13 months, and next fall when the schools will reopen, and many students will be biking to school, including middle and high school, I'm just wondering how this is possibly safe, because when we think of elementary schools, Hoover students navigate Charleston and Middlefield, Addison students navigate Middlefield, Walter Hayes students navigate Embarcadero Middlefield. Most importantly, all of College Terrace students have to cross busy El Camino to get to Green Middle School in Pali. Now, there was a Green middle schooler who was fatally hit by a car trying to cross El Camino while biking last March. And I just don't understand how it's crossing guards and be safe. What is the liability that city has if there's an accident after there's a reduction in crossing guards? I would like to know how much money in dollars is exactly saved by reducing 15 crossing guards. Is it $100,000? Is $100,000 worth it over a year? And what proof 15 crossing guards is as effective and safe for our students as 30, especially after a post-pandemic of 1 year of not biking to school because schools were shut down, to all of a sudden all the kids biking. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, Director Noze, I don't see Chief Johnson on.
I believe he's on.
Chief Johnson, would you have oh, great. Hi.
There he is.
There you go.
Thank you
I'm
very
here.
much.
No, I mean, outstanding point on that question. And first and foremost, the police department is still very engaged in the safety of our children. Crossing guards is not an easy decision. And there are actually quite a bit more than just 15 guards. There's intersections that we provide service for. And that's the issue, is we're going to still make sure that the high traffic intersections have crossing guards available. It's just we're not going to be able to provide service for every intersection that is currently on the contract. And the other complicating factor in this upcoming year is because some of the schools are going to a different schedule, they're asking for more services at different times, which was not necessarily built into the existing contract. So there's the anticipation that the crossing guard contract will actually be going up substantially. But what I also want to let you know is even if that crossing guard contract gets diminished, as I said, I want to reiterate, we will be there for those high impact areas. And we will also continue to have our Adopt a School program where every officer in patrol has specific schools that they're responsible for helping out with the crossing guard programs. So we're going to do the best with what we have. It's a very tough time and these decisions are difficult, but we will be available as needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I want to take a few other questions with hands raised. I see Chris Robel. Chris, if you'd like to speak still, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. I apologize if you already answered this question, but what is the status of a business tax for Palo Alto? I know that we are one of the only cities that does not have one, and to the extent we are doing cuts that are important to residents, like well, crossing guards that was just mentioned and other things. Why is it, why are we not looking at revenue increases and expense cuts at the same time and trying to balance and optimize that overall equation? And so where are we on the business tax? Because I don't know why we are not benchmarked. Do we really want to be the cheapest opportunity for big employers to come in here and add more office space? I mean, it just seems counterintuitive to me.
Sure, let me just reiterate, we did actually cover that earlier in the session. So it is a part of the work plan to begin that discussion later this summer with the plan to cover the issues in preparation for November 2020 general tax election as a possibility. We do have restrictions on the timeframe in which cities can consider general taxes.
Thank you, City Manager Shikada, for that. The next question, individual with their hand raised, is Leah Chester. Leah, if you'd still like to ask a question, please unmute yourself. Leah, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hello?
Yes, you're unmuted. We can hear
Hi,
you.
thank you very much. Excuse me, I'm phoning in from Arizona. And it's a very personal matter, of course, is the Palo Alto Children's Theater. One of the statements I heard, forgive me if I paraphrase, was that you're going to be cutting some productions, and specifically, what productions would those be? The outreach productions that have people going into the school and working with children there, are the one in the theater that are keeping people employed? Because there are some, I feel very passionate about this. I as well as many other individuals who grew up, and the costuming thing too, I'd like to address. I learned how to sew at the Children's Theater. That was not because there was one person being overpaid to make costuming. We had an overseer and volunteers like my mom, and like so many other mothers and fathers who made it happen. I don't know what our budget was then, but I can tell you it was probably far less than it is now. And if it's a matter that you need costumings, I mean, I think that's a little outrageous considering, the plethora that's there, and knowing that I believe Palo Alto, people like Richard Curtis and Katie Chrisman, and I can't even begin the names of people you have there at your disposal to volunteer and keep that theater alive. And I'm one of them. I will do what I can from here, but I'm so sorry. I don't understand what seems to have been a witch hunt against the theater for so many years. And it's the place that really the kids need, We need it. And if you're going to close that, I don't have a lot of hope for the future for Palo Alto.
Thank you, Leah. Director O'Kane, would you, I think you're still available. Would you mind speaking to the question about production impact?
Sure. So we aren't proposing any reduced productions from last year. So we did make reductions in fiscal year 21, and with respect to doing the actual productions. And part of that was due to COVID and the inability for us to actually be able to have in-person theater productions due to the pandemic. The Children's Theater did adapt and pivot very well in being able to do things virtually and able to continue to reach the community and the children that really rely on the Children's Theater for their artistic expression. So the actual productions have not changed from the current fiscal year. They are being reduced, or in fiscal year 21, which is the current fiscal year, they were reduced somewhat due to a reduction in staffing, but that will continue. So there will be productions that will continue at the Children's Theater where there will be less staff support is through the costuming as well as through some front desk staff. But we're still really supporting the Children's Theater. We're, I guess, really wanting to look at alternate ways for the Friends of the Children's Theater and other community members to get involved and really help out with the productions and really support. So if things are continuing and with the proposed budget, and there'll just be some minor changes with respect to costuming and some reduced front desk staff, and that's really the most significant changes that you'll see moving into the next fiscal year.
Thank you, Director O'Kane. Since I have you, there is a question in the chat about the Junior Museum and Zoo and the ticket price being proposed. I'm wondering if you could help talk about the process that you're currently going through related to that.
Sure. So with the new Junior Museum and Zoo, I think most people know that we're shifting from what was previously a free entry into the old Museum and Zoo into a ticketed entry. And originally that ticketed entry fee was proposed to be it was proposed to be $10, and then with a range of membership prices as well. And with our last year budget strategies, we really looked to increase those ticket fees to increase our cost recovery, frankly. And since then, in talking with the Friends of the JMZ and hearing what community members have been saying, we're revisiting that and looking at what it might look like to go below the $18 ticket fee that we proposed in fiscal year 21, but probably higher than what we originally proposed, which was the $10. So we went to Finance Committee earlier this week to start those conversations, and we left that committee meeting with some additional to-dos, which involved looking at what the attendance might be with corresponding to the different ticket prices, and you know, how that fluctuation might occur as the price changes. So we have some additional work to do, and we plan on bringing that back during the budget process. So it's still, currently it is $18 per ticket. That was what council approved last year, and that's what Finance Committee continued to recommend earlier this week. But we're going to continue to do some additional work on that and possibly even get some outside help to come in and help us really understand what we can expect from the Junior Museum and Zoo moving forward. We really do want to make sure that it's accessible to all, and that people have equal opportunity to come and visit our wonderful new facility when it does open. And we do expect it to open in October of this year.
Thank you. Not to keep you on the hot spot, but I do have an additional question.
Sure.
The community
Sure.
also in chat is asking a little bit about the impacts to the Art Center. And somebody specifically is asking about Project Look and also just overall budget impacts to the Art Center. Would you mind commenting on those two aspects?
Sure. So the Art Center does do a lot of educational related programs. So some programs in Palo Alto and some in some of our neighboring communities. So in the proposed budget, there is a reduction to some of those, or one in particular, which is the Project Look. I believe it's Project Look. So some of those will be eliminated and others will be reduced. And this is tied to the reduction in or elimination of exhibitions, which are typically done multiple times a year at the Art Center. So yes, there are reductions in the educational aspect of the Art Center's work related to reaching out to the schools and providing them that sort of the creative education that otherwise they may not be able to get in the schools. So the Art Center is, just a valuable part of our community. We absolutely recognize that and appreciate all the work that they do and just, the creativity that they produce and their ability to have adapted during the pandemic and providing, continuing to provide programming and creative outlets for the community. And we are really striving to keep the Art Center open, but really will likely be limiting it to classes and camps at this time. So some of the programs that the community is used to will be reduced or eliminated until we can get to the point where we're back to recovery.
Thank you very much. We are about at the time where we need to move on to our next section. I do see a number of hands raised. I would recommend you add your questions in the chat so we don't lose your questions. If you want to remember them for the end of the meeting, feel free. But if you'd like to add them into the chat, we'll make sure to try to address those. And if we don't get those to address tonight, we will have time through other ways to answer your questions after the meeting is over. With that, I think I should turn it back to Director Nozay.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Horgan-Taylor. We've spent a lot of time on the city's general fund, and as we just kind of started this conversation, the city has a plethora of funding sources, but the color of money obviously matters. And I say color as different revenue streams have different requirements or restrictions on them. So this next slide is talking about other funds, so funds that are not the general fund. The city has, as we talked about on the far right, enterprise funds or utilities. So these are rate-based services. And you can see on the table to the right, the current proposed rate changes in these utilities. So again, this is gas and water and wastewater, refuse and electric. And so as part of all of these strategies and trying to keep and allow the recovery period to occur, keeping rates as low as possible across the various lines of service. So this results in about a 0.1% increase overall, and to specifically a monthly bill, it's about a 1.4% increase or $4.50 per month. On the left, you can see the, different funds that will be reviewed as part of this. The city receives federal funding through the community development block grant funds. We have development funds from the Stanford University Medical Fund, as well as parking funds. And so all of these will be reviewed in more detail as part of the Finance Committee budget discussion. Through the Q&A, we discussed the capital improvement program, and we have a 5-year capital improvement plan. So over that 5-year period, the current plan is about $727 million. And you can see on the far right, the big chunk of it are enterprise fund projects. And so again, those are those utility projects, maintaining the infrastructure associated with the pipes and the lines to deliver the commodities to the customers. The next big component is the green portion, which are our capital project funds. So we'll go into more detail on that in the next slide. But on this slide, one thing to note is this does reflect a year-over-year decline, both across the 5-year CIP as well as in the 2022 budget. So in addition to a 5-year plan, that 5-year plan obviously includes a proposed budget specifically for FY 2022. So that 2022 capital budget is about $153 million currently as proposed across all funds. It's about a 50% decrease from prior year levels of 300 million. So on the next slide, we dive a little bit further into that capital improvement fund. So the capital improvement fund has a significant component of its revenues from the general fund. One component that we always talk about at the City Council is that general fund transfer. And this slide really shows us the changes we've made as a result of the pandemic, both due to loss of revenue as well as balancing strategies to ensure we're doing our best as an organization to continue to deliver services to the community. So in FY 18, 19, and 20, you can see that there was a base transfer, the green portion of the bars, from the general fund to the capital fund for capital investments. That transfer ranged anywhere from just shy of $10 million to over $10 million, about probably $13 million to over $15 million, probably about $16 million. So on an annual basis, the city was transferring on average $15 million to capital investment. As a result of the pandemic, recognizing the constrained resources, we've dropped that transfer to about $2.5 million, both in 2021 and 2022. So we've seen a significant decline in that. In addition, the blue component is the TOT receipts, or that hotel tax. And as a result of that reduction in tax revenues, we've seen a reduction in the investment in our capital infrastructure as well. On the next slide, really shows how that general capital improvement fund is funded, frankly. So there is discussion over and I think in some of the Q&A, there are some questions about reducing our capital funding, at which point we just went over the general fund portion, but a large portion of our capital investment is from other funding sources. And so that's what this pie is showing. This pie is showing that in that general capital improvement fund, there's a budget of $51 million that's currently proposed in FY 2022. You can see that transfer from the general fund, primarily TOT of 9.7 million. The base transfer is 2.5 of that 9.7. We have reserve or fund balance. So that's just a timing issue between projects that were previously scheduled to occur this year, but are likely delayed until a later year in the CIP. But the majority of the other funds are from things like revenue from other agencies, which are grants or impact fees or in lieu fees. All of these are restricted funds and have to be used for specific purposes. And so it's these are all allocated to the various investments that are currently planned. So on the next slide is just our final poll, I think, that we have for everybody, and a reminder of kind of where we're at in this process. This is very much an iterative process. We started the conversation, frankly, a year ago with our council and the community, and have continued from that point. Specifically for FY 2022, I'm sure many of you have caught the discussions that we've had previously this week on Monday and Tuesday with both the committee and the City Council. Upcoming dates that I just want to make sure everybody is aware of, because these are all times for the community to engage in the budget process and the budget conversation with the City Council, are May 11th and 12th. The Finance Committee will have meetings from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on both of those days to go over both the proposed operating and capital budgets. There are schedules that are posted that have more breakdown detail of when specific topics will be discussed. And so the community, frankly, is encouraged to engage as part of these conversations and these discussions. Obviously, tonight we're doing the town hall. The City Council will resume conversations based on the Finance Committee's feedback on May 17th. So not this coming Monday, but the following Monday. So the full City Council will take this up again. And again, the community can engage in that discussion as well. After that 17th conversation with the City Council, where they provide feedback essentially to their colleagues on the Finance Committee, the Finance Committee will yet again resume this discussion to wrap up, hopefully, their final recommendation to the full City Council for budget adoption, which currently is scheduled on, and I just noticed a typo, June 21st. We will fix that before we disseminate this. So on 5/25, again, it's a 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. meeting schedule time. Where the committee will go over any changes and adjustments that they've deliberated over. On the far right, you can see that staff has released, or the city has released a survey, frankly. So I encourage everybody on this call, as well as everybody in the community, to take this survey. If you go on our city's homepage, there's a news story that's released. We released it yesterday. It'll be posted until May 21st at 12 p.m. And periodically, as you can see through this iterative process, staff will report out to the full City Council as well as the Finance Committee, essentially on a weekly basis on any of the survey results, with the final report out being part of that May 25th wrap-up meeting. So if you are able to take the survey earlier, then they will be able to and make sure that we transfer those results to the committee and the council as they move through this deliberative process. With that, I think I'm turning it back to Ms. Horgan-Taylor.
Thank you. I'm back. We were going to do another poll, but I do want to try to get to some additional questions in our Zoom poll function. City Manager Shikada, did you have a question for me?
No, nothing. Just getting ready to respond to questions. Thank you.
Thank you for being ready. Okay, so I am going to probably put Director O'Kane on the spot again. So thank you in advance, Director O'Kane. There's a question in the chat around middle school athletic programs being impacted, and they would like some additional clarity around what those impacts might be. So I was hoping you might be able to answer that question.
Sure, thank you for that question. So our middle school athletic program has continued, although it has been slightly modified due to the pandemic. We will continue that program as the health order allows. And so that includes doing all the same sports that we've been doing pre-pandemic. The position reduction that is proposed in the budget is a position that was originally intended to expand the middle school athletic program in ways that we haven't done in the past, and also provide support to our lead recreation coordinator who oversees all of our middle school athletic and adult sports programs. So for the public, there should be little difference in what you experience through the middle school athletic program. There might be some reduced response time if you reach out to staff looking for assistance or have questions, but I can assure you that we will do our best to respond as quickly as possible. It may not be as quick as you've experienced in the past, but everything else should remain the same.
Thank you, Director O'Kane. Director Nozay, there is a question, and also City Manager Shikada might be able to help with this one. Can we talk a little bit about how the cuts were prioritized? Some of the community members are seeing why some departments have bigger cuts than others.
Sure. Let's see, Director Nozay, you want to take a cut? Sorry for the poor choice of words. In terms of the process.
Sure. So ultimately, this is I'm sure every director will have their opinions of this, a multi-month process that we go through, because to be honest, as our city manager outlined at the get-go, this isn't easy for us. Our line of business is to provide services to this community, and reducing those services is just about the last thing we want to do, especially in our professions. What we do is really look through all of the potential reductions across the organization and do our best to find a balance in terms of the level of service to the community, impacts to the volume of community members that may use a service, and trying and find some balancing strategy of the, alternatives amongst alternatives that no one wants to do, basically. And so although we could, and I'm sure some corporations do, a flat line across the board, everyone takes a blank percentage reduction, we really do try and take a finer point to it to maximize every dollar that's spent and minimize any reductions and the impact to the community as much as possible, acknowledging that obviously there will be impacts. So I will say it's a delicate balance that we try and hit citywide.
And if I could just add to that, recognizing the qualitative and the judgment call that comes into any one of these decisions, we do recognize that, as we call it, just chipping away at existing programs is very painful. And so as a result, and in some ways can result in none of our programs being successful. So it does, in many cases, lead to the need to make a decision between cutting a program entirely and in order to retain the critical mass or critical level of activity in other programs. So that's a part of the decision making as well. And again, ultimately, we do have an obligation to bring forward a balanced budget. And so that is exactly what we've done here. It does recognize that the discussions that are ongoing and that will be happening through the City Council Finance Committee and ultimately the council decision will need to balance these proposed cuts with the ultimate values that represent Palo Alto's interests. And so that's the process that we're in the middle of right now.
Thank you. There's a question where it seems that the community member is suggesting there's budget increases for social justice and climate change. So I just want to clarify our current budget specifically to those couple areas.
There really has not been a budget increase. It does reflect areas of activity. So certainly in terms of our sustainability and climate action plan, that is a part of our work plan, as is our race and equity work plan, both of which we're pursuing, one as ongoing activities that reflect current priorities for the community, and two are also reflective of the fact that as we come out of the pandemic, are important elements of our community recovery. The sustainability is a long-standing value of the Palo Alto community and also an economic driver. And so as we look at issues of how we build back in the areas of activity, how we as an organization are focused on supporting residents' desire to renovate their homes, as an example, that the way that we provide the service in a sustainable manner is an important dimension of the service. So there hasn't been an increase in funding in either of those areas, but do reflect the values and in many ways the way we hope to do our work, in addition to specific deliverables that we as programs and as staff are orienting the work we're bringing forward to the City Council. Hope that responds to the question.
Yes, thank you very much. There are a few questions around Tier 2. So I did want to take a few of those, and Director Nozay, you might be between City Manager Shikada or Director Nozay, you might be able to help support this. If the council was to choose a Tier 2 reduction that's on the current list, how would staff prioritize those reductions?
Well, I think that is actually, to be honest, a policy call for our city council to be making. So ultimately, staff hopes that all of the assumption as part of this 2022 proposed budget, especially those that are uncertain, will hold. And frankly, I hope the recovery is faster than the current budget projects. However, should it be necessary to implement Tier 2 because assumptions are unable to be met, then it would be a policy call by our City Council on what further additional reductions they would like the city to explore.
Sorry, and if I could add one more sort of example to that, as has been discussed tonight, many of the reductions that are already a part of the proposed budget are difficult decisions. And so the council could direct staff to say, we don't like those choices or some of the choices that are in the proposed budget. In order to reverse that, there are some funds available, but again, we through staff will go through the math of restorations of proposals or proposed reductions, and if necessary, we'll look to the Tier 2 proposals and perhaps just in direct response to the question, if the council directs us to take a Tier 2 proposal, it would really, in all likelihood, be because it was necessary in order to maintain a balanced budget while restoring a part of the proposed. Or if there, again, as Director Noze pointed out, if one of our assumptions was determined to be inappropriate, inaccurate, whether it be ability to reach agreement with our labor organizations or other that required us to go deeper into reductions.
Thank you for that. The other question is back on the city's reserves and how the city holds those reserves aside. What's the process there? Does the city reinvest those or invest those funds? Somebody had a question about just overall reserves and how those are set aside.
Sure. I will see if I answer this correctly or to the intent of the question. As I had mentioned before, the council has a policy to have a budget stabilization reserve between 15 and 20% with a target of 18.5%. Across all funds, the city does carry reserves, I will say, associated with council policy, and that policy is set based on the risk associated with each of the lines of business. The city does invest its funds. So we have a arm, so to speak, and arm is a very incorrect term. We have a fingernail of a staff person that does our debt and our investments and our treasury work that does invest our city's about $500 million portfolio of cash in various investments. That strategy is outlined in an investment policy that's brought to council on an annual basis, reviewed and approved by them, and ultimately is also governed by significant state law. So it's not like the city is able to take funds that are sitting in a reserve and go invest them as we would our personal funds in the stock market. We do have to follow some significant restrictions that are frankly there to mitigate the risk associated with our investments.
Thank you for that question, that answer. I'm trying to look through. There were a few questions around fees, and I think Director O'Kane might be able to speak to this one specifically. Trying to look for it. Specifically around cost recovery on programs, just trying to better understand how the city works through that, but also does the city offer reduced price for those in the community that may have special needs and related to that, and will those fees or reductions in fees still be honored in the coming year?
Thank you for that question. So a couple things here. One is we do have a cost recovery policy that we do follow closely, and it's related to what our specific programs and services provide. So for example, if there's a low cost recovery, which is for programs and services that reach a greater audience so that they're available to the general public. And then there is high cost recovery. And these are things that are more individualized, so that benefit maybe one person or two people. And also where people have the opportunity and the option to get that same service somewhere else. We do also have a fee reduction program. So that has been expanded in the last few years to include adults. It used to be just for children and people with disabilities. It's now open to everyone to apply for that fee reduction program. There are specific requirements for being able to apply and be approved for that, but that will still exist moving forward. And we encourage people to really apply for that. I guess additionally, what I'd like to say is we're continually looking for other opportunities to partner with other organizations on how we can provide programs and services to the community. And we now more than ever really need to do that, and we will continue to be doing that in the future.
If I could add to that, there is also discussion on that point of working with other organizations, discussion among the city council, with the city council in terms of programs delivered by other nonprofits. And so continuing to explore what that mix of services and programs provided by the city, as well as through nonprofit partners and other agencies, are also important considerations as we go through our own budget challenges, but also reflect the recognition that the city is not the only service provider. And so important for us to consider that as a part of the overall range of services that are available to the community. One other point I wanted to just amplify on the topic of cost recovery is that in addition to our community service department, cost recovery is certainly a principle that applies wherever possible throughout departments across the city. And so whether it be, well, as a particular example, development services, as people are seeking permits, that those are 100% cost recovery, while at the same time recognizing that there are legal restrictions, and so as a result are not greater than 100% cost recovery. So there are boundaries on which cost recovery can be a principle that's used, basically that the user pays for the services received. That it is a principle that's used across the city's services.
Thank you. There's a question from a community member about the crossing guards, and was hoping to see if the city has a map associated with where the crossing guards will be stationed in the coming year with these reductions. Chief Johnson, would you be able to maybe respond to that?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And again, just to reiterate, safety of our children is always paramount. And the locations are actually part of the 5-year contract. This is a contract with an outside company. Those 29 locations, which are standard throughout the school year, and 12 during the summer sessions, are mandated and identified in collaboration, not just with us, but with the Safe Route staff, as well as the Palo Alto Unified School District. So in the event that it's determined to reduce those locations, that's a conversation we'll make sure we have with all the involved parties before making any changes. And again, that is a map we can put out and let the public be aware of. So we have those locations.
Thank you. That's something we can add to be released potentially next week. Okay. There are a few questions, Director Noze, around one of the first segments of our presentation tonight, around essential travel. And so I just wanted to ask that question specifically about how the city is approaching travel now and in the coming year.
Sure. So the city's frozen basically a number of more discretionary lines of expenses, frankly, over the past year and as we move forward. So for example, we do have a hiring freeze. So every position we're reviewing before we bring on a new employee to fill it. And travel and other discretionary expenses are under strict review, basically. Obviously, under the COVID pandemic, pretty much no one's traveling anywhere. And we've taken action across the organization to, we did it actually as part of mid-year, to pull the travel funding from all departments as in recognition of this reduction, frankly. So we'll continue to review it. Some travel may be necessary for maintaining certificates or licenses, professional licenses, in order for staff to continue to perform their jobs and maintain those for their job duties. But it's only in those circumstances that we've been authorizing those kinds of activities.
If I could also add, as is always the case with an organization that's involved with a range of services as the city is, as Director Noze pointed out, there could be mandated travel that requires staff to attend. There are inspections that can be necessary for equipment that we're procuring, where manufacture is happening out of state or what have you. Obviously, as she pointed out, given the pandemic, that's a very small volume of situations, but nonetheless want to acknowledge that that's the case.
Thank you. There's another question that sort of speaks to part of the budget strategy around being able to respond quickly as the economy recovers. And so I'm wondering if either City Manager Shikada or Director Noze could speak to how overall the city would approach that. So for example, if there currently is something that's reduced as part of July 1st, how will the city prioritize what gets restored back as the economy improves?
Yeah, let me kind of speak to the process, perhaps is the best way to handle that. We have increased the frequency of tracking revenue to a level that really is somewhat unprecedented, while at the same time recognizing that for revenue sources such as sales tax, there is a great deal of volatility and quite frankly, difficulty in relying on any, so let's say, quarterly revenues in order to reliably forecast what that means for the year ahead. Just really given the complexities of the way that sales tax is both received and then distributed by state agencies, that on a quarter by quarter basis, there is quite a bit of volatility in the funding that comes forward. So that said, the City Council has regularly asked for updates on revenues, and that has enabled ongoing discussions of how best to allocate funds that are available. What was done in this past year was set aside some funding really to address unmet needs or potential unanticipated needs related to the pandemic that we have been able to use for rent relief for some of the organizations that rely on the city as a landlord. And so that's one example in addition to other unanticipated needs that can occur over the course of the year. I expect that will be the case, and having some contingencies plans in place for unanticipated expenses would be a prudent strategy for us to do in this upcoming year. And also as it relates to, let's say, the hopeful scenario in which revenues are coming in faster than we're forecasting. And once again, we'll be discussing that with the City Council and where best to position the organization to quickly ramp up. And I do believe that staffing is a part of that mix, while at the same time recognizing that staffing is not something that changes in staffing, certainly staffing up, doesn't happen very quickly. So I would expect us to rely on near-term contracts, partnerships with other organizations that might be able to scale up more quickly in order to allow us to ramp up when it does appear prudent for us to do that. And certainly, Director Noze, please feel free to redirect or amplify as you see appropriate.
Yeah, no, I guess I would just echo that we do quarterly meetings with our full council now. We used to do this with just our finance committee, but we've elevated it over this past year and expect to continue to do that, frankly, at council's direction already over this coming year, so that we can continue to monitor the pace of the recovery and make adjustments. And I think we've done that this year, and the council has been very receptive to that, and I will continue as we move through and do our best to adjust as quickly as possible.
Not directly on point, but I did want to answer one question I saw in the chat related to managers and manager salaries and the like. I know that that's an ongoing topic of discussion, certainly of concern when we see reductions in frontline services, that there's naturally a question of manager salaries and the like. I would like to point out a couple of elements. One is that in our last fiscal year, that managers across the city did take reductions in compensation, and that we sincerely appreciate the reductions that they made, the sacrifices that they made on behalf of the organization. And that was important to enable us to restore some of the reductions that would have otherwise been required last year. I would note that, and this applies not just to managers, but to our staff across the organization, that quite frankly, Palo Alto is in a worse situation than many of our peer agencies within Santa Clara County and in the Bay Area in terms of the magnitude of revenue reductions that we are planning for. And that is really based on the reductions and the impacts that were discussed earlier in the presentation. So as a result, we do need to be sensitive to the messages that we're sending to our staff. We do want to keep our excellent workforce that is providing services to the community. And so given that it is a balance between a recognition of our employees' desire and willingness to make personal sacrifices for us, the good of both the community as well as the organization and fellow employees, while also recognizing we need to be realistic in terms of the marketplace that we operate in and our ability to attract and retain, and emphasis on retain, the workforce we need to deliver these services.
Thank you. I did want to mention there were a few questions about if our session tonight will be available online. So I wanted to take a moment to offer an answer to that so that everyone can hear. This is a live session. It is being directly streamed right now on YouTube, and it will also stay there as a recording. So anyone who missed our town hall today can go to our YouTube channel and view it at any time. So just wanted to mention that. I also wanted to mention, since the slide is up, we do have an online budget survey open. It will be open until May 21st at noon. So feel free to share that information with your community networks. You can get to the online survey directly from our homepage under news. And it's a specific news story there related to the budget survey itself. So I just wanted to take a moment and mention that.
And in particular, recognizing that we have a free form section of the survey that people will be able to provide comments that I'm sure you will want to convey to the City Council directly. Certainly ourselves, myself, and the staff that are involved with this process will be reviewing those comments as well. But we do want to encourage members of the community to use that survey instrument as a way to ensure that your message are conveyed to the City Council, as we will be compiling that and sharing it both with the Finance Committee as well as with the City Council as a whole. Depending on the volume of comments received, we may find that it's important and worthwhile to send batches of the comments received over the next few weeks. But we want to make sure that you know that we're committing to ensure that that information is conveyed to the full City Council.
And thank you, City Manager Shikada, for mentioning that. We are planning on taking survey results in different phases back to the Finance Committee and the Council. So next week on Tuesday, we'll be providing a summary of results to the Finance Committee. And then the following week, we'll be presenting a summary at that time to the Council on the 17th. And then the full survey results will be presented to the Finance Committee on before the 25th. So that's kind of our time frame related to the survey. Just wanted to mention that. In terms of time, I know that we have a few questions hand raised. I did want to mention we are getting close to our time of wrapping up. And so if you do have specific questions, feel free to put them in the Zoom Q&A chat, and we will make sure as we move forward with our blog communications and other communications back to the Finance Committee, we'll make sure to note those questions accordingly. But to wrap up, I was hoping to give the last word to City Manager Shikada as we close tonight.
All right, thank you. Well, just want to close as we started by thanking you, members of our community, for participating with us this evening. Again, recognizing that this is a really difficult conversation, and we know that the reductions that we've proposed are really challenging and a challenging time. And so once again, just really want to thank you for participating with us tonight. We know that we will be able to continue the dialogue over the process of the next few weeks and going to City Council's decisions on the budget. But perhaps I would just note that, as was reflected in many of the comments we heard tonight, this budget is not a one-time issue. And it can be one, and it really should be one, that reflects an ongoing dialogue and continuing evaluation of how we as a community can ensure that the best services are provided for the community, whether it be by the city or by partners, and in partnership with the community as a whole. So again, just want to say thank you and appreciate your involvement with us. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close.
Thank you very much.